Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is Isaac, and today we will be reviewing the 1977 release by Suicide called Suicide. It is their debut album, and it certainly has a lot of aspects to discuss. So I'd like to start as I did last time with Ask Rufus, with the context around this album. Suicide as a band really is more of a duo, not, obviously they still form a band, but they are a duo of Alan Vega and Martin Rev. I think the most, perhaps arresting part of their, act is even in the name itself, right? So we're kind of taken aback by the fact that the band's called Suicide, and we don't really know what to expect, but we know, I think, that it's going to be something sort of mean and rough and difficult to pin down. I would say something aggressive, maybe. We're met with the album itself, which is a little, more subdued than in places. It's more subdued than you might expect. At any rate, according to Wikipedia, the album or the band's name came from a Ghost Rider comic book called Satan's Suicide. They kind of elaborate. This is an interview with Alan Vega in 2002. He sort of elaborates that this kind of also reflects the state of society in the 70s. Society's suicide, as he says. Especially particularly American society, right? The things like, the Vietnam War, he references also the collapse, he says, of New York City, which is where they were based out of. So he says here, and I think it's quite interesting, he says, the name Suicide said it all to us. It's interesting, right? Like to sort of see the encapsulation of the times in the name itself of the band and therefore of the album. However, while the band Suicide started performing in 1970, their debut album would not come out until 77, which is the album we're talking about today. Interestingly, they started calling themselves punk music, right? According to Wikipedia, they were one of the first acts to use the word punk music, which is interesting because their record here is very much not punk, right? I wouldn't call it punk. It might be somewhat adjacent to punk in its way, but it's definitely more electronic, more subdued, more, parts of it are in your face, but most of it is, this more experimental, like electronic music. At any rate, they performed at various venues, notably in New York City, Max's Kansas City, and CBGB, both of which are kind of legendary musical music venues that have since, gone away. But at the time in the 70s, they were pretty legendary. For instance, Max's Kansas City on Park Avenue South in NYC. They had bands like the Velvet Underground who played there often. Indeed, if you go on Apple Music or Spotify, there's a record that is them, the Velvet Underground live at Max's Kansas City. Andy Warhol also went down there, perhaps predictably. But we also had people like involved in glam rock. So, for instance, Mark Bolan of T-Rex, David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Lou Reed, Alice Cooper, and more. So that's interesting, to think about. And then we have other big names like Bruce Springsteen who performed there, Patti Smith, for instance. And then CBGB, I had heard of CBGB before listening and doing the background research for this record, but actually there's, a bit more to it than I knew. So this is in the East Village of Manhattan, in New York, of course. And it, soon became known for punk rock and also new wave bands. So we have, for instance, the Ramones, Dead Boys, Television, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, Patti Smith, Blondie, and Talking Heads. But also Suicide performed there too. Okay. And then, so that's the context of the band Suicide, and also, that's the context of the band. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the genre, which we've kind of hinted at already. Wikipedia lists the following genres for this record: synth punk, electronic rock, synth pop, electronic, minimalist, right? And I think those are pretty spot on, right? Minimalist is mostly true. It's a sort of subtle sound. We don't really think about, it's with the name Suicide, you may think that it would be super intense, super in your face. And it is at points, right? Especially on that Frankie Teardrops track. But in the majority of cases, it's more subtle. It's more just a subdued electronic sound, which is, quite interesting, especially at the time, right? And I, was sort of taken aback by the fact that the electronic aspect is sort of at the center of the album. This is sort of the centerpiece, of this sound, I would say. Okay. And then, this is also at a time before synths and electronic sound would become so, at least to my knowledge, would become so ubiquitous, right? I'm thinking of the 80s, which are so well known for the synth sound, that sort of, that infiltrated pop music, and that is so, so characteristic of the 80s. This is in 77, so this is a bit before that, and certainly in the early 70s, that would be well before that. Now, another interesting thing here is the influence of this album and of this band, right? An unlikely influence Wikipedia cites, and I think it's unlikely anyway, is Bruce Springsteen, whose music certainly, from what I've heard, doesn't really have anything to do with Suicide, but he did do a cover for Alan Vega later on in Alan Vega's life, or I think in the early 21st century he did that. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, and then the year, our next and last point of the context, is 1977, right? So actually, it's the same year that Ask Rufus was released, and it's interesting to think about how at the same time in the same country we have very different musical sounds, music, that is, that has nothing to do with each other realistically. So, again, this was the year Elvis Presley died. This is also, we have the president being Jimmy Carter. And then, this is also the year that Songs in the Key of Life wins Album of the Year at the Grammys. Yet another sort of example of a totally different sound from this record. And again, the Sex Pistols came out with Nevermind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols, which to me is a bit closer to Suicide, but certainly still a markedly different sound, more in your face. Certainly a cornerstone or a touchstone rather, of the punk rock scene. Okay, so, and now on to sort of my impressions here. So this section I'm calling The Road Not Taken, in quotes, right, out of the reference to Robert Frost's poem, which is a rather obvious influence. I'm not a huge Robert Frost fan or anything, but, it's become so not integral, but it's become such a part of the cultural discourse over the last several decades that, The Road Not Taken is very clearly rendered practically meaningless, but I use it here anyway. So my sort of point here in saying The Road Not Taken is that, when we start out the album with the first track, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is Ghost Rider, we see, and then later on with Rocket USA, we see this sort of catchy use of electronic sound, or rather, it's almost catchy, right? We have sort of here a indication that this band, Suicide, could have indeed gone in a direction of making pop music, in other words, but they're markedly not doing that, right, as we see throughout But that's what stood out to me, the most, I think, from this record is that they clearly did not take a certain direction, right? They consciously decided, look, we could make an electronic sound that, is catchier, is more pleasant to the ear, is more of an earworm type track, but they decided not to do that, right? Now, of course, this is purely speculative on my part, right? As a sort of aside, right? This isn't like, I know for a fact that they had a moment where they decided not to make pop music, but my point is, in listening to these two tracks of Ghost Rider and Rocket USA, you can hear that they had the potential to make more popular music for sure, and yet they didn't, right? So yet they just decided to go with the more dark themes and the more arresting lyrics and sound. In a similar vein, then, the other thing that stood out to me was the social commentary, right? We have Frankie Teardrop, who is basically a lower class person who is, has to deal with various demands of that same status. And, his mental health degrades until and we're told all this in this 10-minute long song, right? He kills his wife and infant child, and then kills himself, right? And then, this is sort of emphasized by the screams in that track also. So, it's definitely a social commentary for sure, right? It's saying something about what it's like to be lower class, the mental toll that, even more broadly speaking, the simple stressor of not having enough to eat, not having enough to, not a simple stressor certainly, but a stressor of not having enough to eat, not having enough to pay the bills, and so on, can really degrade your mental health. And then, in this extreme example, obviously, in other words, it can take a toll on how you act and how you interface with the world. So that's probably the most arresting and most overt of the social commentary that we see in this record. However, we also see this sort of sexuality in the song "Girl," which seems to me to be very sort of intentionally nasty in the sense of we're meant to be a little like repulsed, I guess, not because sexuality of this sort is inherently repulsive, but rather because, we have this overt sexual desire and indeed perhaps an overt sexual act, right? The sort of, it's laid bare for us what it's like to be, having a sexual encounter and things like this. So, it's interesting because we have, obviously in popular music for decades now, we have sex talked about obliquely, indirectly, in various degrees of directness. And here it's kind of laid bare for us, the literal sounds that you may expect to hear during sex, right? It's quite intriguing to hear that and be kind of repulsed because not because it's intrinsically repulsive, but because you don't expect to hear that in a song, right, necessarily. At least not to this degree and to this sort of tenor, I guess. And indeed, it also has to do with this sort of contradistinction with the lovey-dovey sex that we see in things like, things of the 60s, for instance. This idea that love is all you need, right, as the Beatles say, which obviously is more about the feeling of love and the practice of love than the making of love, obviously. But I think in that flower power type movement that we have in the 60s, certainly sex is an important aspect of that. But it's this flowery, peaceful sex, right? This liberatory movement rather than a sort of thing that repulses. So that's an interesting sort of, contrast between what we see here in 1977 and what we saw in the 60s. Okay, all that said, however, I was not a huge fan of this record. I think it has certainly the social commentary to make it relevant. I can see why it's on this list, right? There's some times that I've been listening to these records on this list that I think, this didn't really have to be on the list. This case is one that I can see why it's on the list. It certainly was formerly inventive, but I think it's also in the right place on the list at number 497. this sort, or sorry, 498. It's, it doesn't age so well, but you can tell that it influenced people that came later, in other words. So for that reason, I ranked it a 5 out of 10. So that's the rating for Suicide, the album, of course. And, so yeah, again, I understood it conceptually. I think, especially as I wrote the script for this video, I began to appreciate it a bit more for sure. But, my first impression of the album was not strong. It was very much like, okay, I see what you're doing, but it's not very pleasant to listen to, which isn't to say that there's not a delight sometimes in unpleasant sounding music, such as the Velvet Underground with the screeching violins on the Black Angels Death song, for instance. But here we have something that's there's not even a relish in the disgusting sound. It's more designed to actually be displeasing to the ear. So that's interesting, but also, again, not a record I would find myself listening to over and over again, certainly, or even returning to that much. So, so that is my review here of Suicide's 1977 record, Suicide. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and we will be back hopefully sooner than the distance between this video and the last one to listen to number 497, which is a record that I can't remember right now, but it's it's another release, certainly, that will, it is The Indestructible Beat of Soweto, by various artists in South Africa and in Soweto. So that certainly is a different note and different sound to this more dire and more arresting record that we talked about today. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.